I warned you. Get up now! You're out of here! Look at me when I'm talking to you. You can't keep doing this.
I understand.
Then act like it.
The man in the cheap suit grabbed Walter Ksiazek by the collar of his coat and hauled him up out of the booth so fast that the old man's coffee cup tipped and rolled off the edge of table 7 and shattered on the floor of the diner. You don't get to sit here all night nursing one cup, old man. This is a business, not a shelter. It was 2:14 in the morning at a Denny-style truck stop off Interstate 17, the kind of place that never turns its lights off because the highway never sleeps. 6 people were in the dining room. A trucker with a plate of eggs, 2 college kids splitting fries, a woman crying quietly into her phone in a corner booth. None of them looked up. The manager kept twisting the fabric of Walter's coat in his fist. Walter, 69 years old, did not raise his hands to defend himself. He only looked down at the broken cup on the tile and said, very quietly, "I'm sorry about the mug." That was the moment Daniela Reyes came out of the kitchen with a tray of waters and saw a grown man being shaken like a dog in the section she was responsible for. What the manager did not know, what made him the smallest man in Phoenix that night, was that the broke old stranger he was throwing out had spent 31 years signing his name to the load calculations of bridges that 2 million people drove across without ever once being afraid. To understand what happened, you have to go back 4 months to the first night Walter sat down at table 7. He came in a little after 2, the way he always would, when the dinner rush was a memory and the breakfast rush was still hours off. He wore a gray coat that had once been expensive and was now simply old. Buttoned to the throat against an air conditioning, he seemed to feel more than other people. He asked for a black coffee and nothing else. He took out a thick spiral notebook, the kind a student buys for 98 cents, and he wrote, page after page, numbers, mostly. Daniela could see them when she refilled his cup. Long columns of figures, little sketches of beams and angles, words crossed out and rewritten. She was 24. She worked the overnight shift because it paid an extra $1.10 an hour and because it let her be home in the daytime with her brother. Mateo was 19, autistic, nonverbal most days, and the state's idea of support for him was a waiting list with 400 names on it. So Daniela worked nights, slept in fragments, and did the math that poor people do, the math where every dollar has somewhere to be before you've even earned it. The first week, Walter only ever ordered the coffee. The second week, Daniela noticed he wasn't eating. Not there, not anywhere from the look of his wrists. So on a Tuesday, she set down a plate of eggs and pieces of toast next to his notebook and said, "Kitchen made it wrong table. I can't put it back." So he looked at the plate, then at her face. He had sharp eyes, sharper than she expected from a man who slept rough. "You're a poor liar, miss." "I'm a great liar," she said. "I just don't waste it on eggs." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he picked up the fork the way a man picks up something he's decided to be grateful for instead of ashamed of. "Thank you," he said. "Walter, Daniela." She rang the eggs into her own tab at the end of the shift. $2.40. She did it the next night, too, and the night after that, and within 2 weeks, it had stopped being a decision and become a thing that was simply true about her life. The way the bus route was true. The way Mateo's morning routine was true. Black coffee, eggs, 2 toast, table 7, 2 a.m. It cost her about $16 a week. She did not have $16 a week. She did it anyway. Walter talked once he started. He told her he had been an engineer. Bridges, he said, and overpasses, and once a stadium roof in a city he wouldn't name. He told her about a span he'd worked on where the steel had come in under spec and he'd made them tear out 4 months of work and start again, and how the contractor had screamed at him in a trailer for an hour, and how he'd held the line because the alternative was a number he wasn't willing to sign. "You sign your name to a thing," he told her, tapping the notebook. "You're telling every stranger who ever drives across it that you'd put your own kid in the car. That's the whole job. That's the only job." He had a daughter once. he let slip one night, not in so many words but in the careful way he stepped around it. There had been a wife and a house in a suburb of Chicago with a maple in the yard, and a girl who used to sit on his drafting table and color while he worked. The wife was gone now, years gone, cancer. The daughter he would not talk about at all except to say once, looking at nothing, "She thinks I lost my mind." Easier for her that way. Easier to have a crazy father than to wonder if everything he said was true. He never explained it further. He just turned the page in his notebook and asked Daniela how her brother was sleeping, and she understood that the door had opened a crack and then closed again, and that she was not meant to push on it. Daniela figured he was exaggerating. Maybe he'd been a draftsman once, maybe something had broken in him, maybe the bridges were the kind of thing a lonely man builds out of a smaller true thing to make the nights feel bigger. She'd seen it before. She didn't correct him. She just kept the coffee coming and let him talk, because he talked to her like she was a person who could understand load and stress and the weight a thing could carry before it failed. And almost nobody in her life talked to her like she could understand anything at all. Not everyone was kind to him. One night in the second month, a man in a polo shirt with a company logo on the chest stopped by the booth on his way out and looked Walter up and down and said, loud enough for the room, "They let anybody in here now." Walter didn't answer. His hand, resting on the notebook, closed slowly into a fist, the knuckles going white, and then, just as slowly, opened again. He smoothed the page flat with his palm. He waited until the man was gone before he picked his pen back up. Daniela watched the whole thing from the coffee station and felt something hot move through her chest. "You didn't have to take that," she said, coming over. "Taking it costs me nothing," Walter said. "Answering it costs me the page I was on." He looked up at her with that sad, knowing half-smile. "You've got a temper. That's all right. Keep it where you can find it. You'll need it someday." She didn't understand what he meant. Not then. She just topped off his cup and went to check on table 4. Daniela's apartment was a one-bedroom on the second floor of a complex where the pool had been drained and fenced off for 2 years. She and Mateo split the bedroom. She slept on a foot in the front room when he needed the quiet of a door that closed. Rent was $840 a month. She was, on the night the bridge came down, 11 days late on it, with a note already taped to her door that used the word proceedings. Her kitchen counter was a museum of the same exhibit. A past-due electric bill, a letter from Mateo's clinic about a copay program that had ended, a flyer for a civil engineering certificate program at the community college that she had circled in pen 4 months ago and not allowed herself to think about since, because the math didn't work. The math never worked. She wanted to design things. She had wanted it since she was a girl who built impossible towers out of anything that stacked. It was the most expensive wish she owned, so she kept it in the back of a drawer in her mind and only took it out when she was too tired to stop herself. She told herself, the way she told herself most weeks, that she would stop buying Walter's breakfast. Just for a while, just until the electric was current. He would understand. He'd probably order her to stop if he knew how close to the edge she was living. But every night at 2, she made the same wrong, necessary choice, and she could not have told you why, except that walking past table 7 and not stopping felt like a thing she would not be able to live inside of afterward. There was one morning that month she thought about often after. She'd come home at the end of a shift, gray with exhaustion, and found Mateo awake before her, sitting on the kitchen floor where the light came in. He had taken every dry good in the cabinet, the cans, the rice box, a sleeve of crackers, and stacked them into a tower nearly as tall as he was, balanced impossibly, can on box on can, the heavy things placed with a care that no one had taught him. He did not look at her. He never looked at people. But he reached up and laid one finger on the very top of the tower, the lightest possible touch, the exact amount of weight it could take without coming down, and he held it there, and he hummed. Daniela sat down on the floor next to him and did not say anything and did not touch the tower. She just watched her brother understand, in whatever wordless way he understood things, that a structure is a conversation between what bears down and what holds up, and that the whole art of it is knowing precisely how much a thing can carry. She thought about Walter and his columns of figures. She thought, They would have liked each other, those two. The man who has no words and the man whose words nobody believes. She made breakfast around the tower and left it standing for 3 days. In the 3rd month, Walter changed. He started looking over his shoulder. He moved to the booth that faced the door. One night he asked her casually whether the diner kept its security footage and for how long, and when she said she didn't know, probably a week, he nodded, like that was an important and unwelcome fact. He stopped telling stories about the past and started saying things she didn't follow, about a company, about a man named Voss, about a report nobody would read. They didn't fire me. You understand? He said once with no preamble, staring into his coffee. Firing leaves a record. They made it so there was no me to fire. You can't appeal a thing that was never written down. Daniela thought the loneliness had finally taken the turn she'd been afraid of. She started slipping an extra $1's worth of food onto the plate, as if the eggs he was himself. Then came the last night he was himself. It was near the end of the 3rd month. He came in pale, thinner, with a tremor in his right hand that hadn't been there before. He didn't open the notebook he always wrote in. Instead, he took from inside his coat a different one, older, the cover real leather gone soft and dark at the corners, and he set it on the table between them and put his hand flat on top of it like a man swearing an oath. I need you to do something for me, he said, and I need you to not ask me why. Walter, if a night comes when I don't walk through that door, he said, I need you to keep this. Don't read it or read it. It won't help you either way without the rest. Don't take it to the police. His eyes were very clear and very tired. The police are how it got buried the first time. You hold on to it until somebody comes asking for me by my whole name. Walter Andrzej Ksiazek. If they don't know the middle name, they're not the right person, and you've never seen me in your life. He pushed it across the table. Promise me. She should have said no. She should have said, this is too much. I have a brother, I can't carry your secret. Instead, she looked at his shaking hand on the worn leather, and she heard herself say, I promise. He took his hand away like setting down a great weight. Good girl, he said. Now bring me the coffee. We'll talk about something else. She locked the notebook in the cabinet under the register where the lost and found lived, behind a single unmatched glove and a phone charger nobody had ever claimed. She did not read it. She told herself she'd give it back the next night and tell him to find somewhere safer for it. She thought, on the bus home that morning, about how she had agreed so easily. She was a person who agreed to things easily. It was both the best and the worst thing about her. She had agreed to take an extra shift the week her own rent came due so a coworker could see her kid's recital. She had agreed to keep buying eggs for a stranger when she couldn't keep her own lights on. Now she had agreed to hold a dying man's secret without even knowing what it was. She told herself it was a notebook, that it weighed nothing, that a promise to an old man at 2 in the morning was the kind of thing the daylight quietly dissolved. She was wrong about that, the way she was wrong about most of the small things she did that turned out not to be small. There was no next night. Walter didn't come the next night, or the one after. On the 3rd night, the manager threw a man out of table 7 for nursing 1 cup of coffee, and on the 4th, when Daniela finally got someone at the county to talk to her, a tired voice told her that an unidentified male, late 60s, had died of heart failure under the overpass at 19th Avenue, and that there was no family on record, no name they could confirm, nothing to release to anyone, and no one to release it to. She hung up the phone in the diner's back hallway and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor among the mop buckets, and she did not cry, because the grief was too big to fit through anything as small as crying. She thought about the notebook in the cabinet and felt sick. A dead man's delusion locked behind a lost glove. She thought, more than once over the next 2 weeks, about throwing it away. It frightened her. That leather book, the way a thing frightens you when you suspect it might be heavier than you can afford to lift. She would later be able to name the exact morning she almost did it. It was a Sunday, just after 6, the sky going pink over the freeway. The electric company had sent its final notice. She had $91 to her name, and the rent proceedings had a date on them now. She took the trash to the dumpster behind the kitchen with the leather notebook on top of the bag, having decided, finally, that she was nobody, that she was a girl who poured coffee, that whatever a sad old man had imagined the world owed him was not a thing she could collect on his behalf. She stood at the open lid with the book in her hand, and because she was already throwing it away because it didn't matter anymore, she let it fall open to the last written page. It wasn't numbers. Daniela R., he had written, in a careful hand from before the tremor. Night shift. Brother at home, the boy who doesn't speak. Pays for my breakfast out of her own tips and lies about it badly. 9 years I've been looking for one honest person to leave this with. I think I finally found her. If you're reading this, Daniela, I'm sorry. You didn't ask for the weight. But you're the only one I trusted to carry it, and that has to be worth something to you, the way it's worth everything to me. She did not throw the notebook away. She took it back inside, and she washed the coffee off her hands, and she put it in her bag and carried it home, where she put it in the drawer in her bedroom underneath the circled flyer for the certificate she would never afford. 11 days later, at 4:40 in the morning, the Salt River crossing came down. Daniela was wiping table 7 when it happened. The TV bolted up in the corner cut to a live aerial shot, a helicopter circling a black gap where 6 lanes of bridge had been, the river dark beneath it, emergency lights pooling red and blue on the banks. The crawl along the bottom set a span of the new Salt River crossing. The project the whole city had spent 18 months bragging about, the ribbon cut by the mayor only that spring, had collapsed during the early freight hours. They didn't have a number on the dead yet. They would by morning. 6. A trucker, a nurse coming off shift, a family of 3 driving home from a hospital in Tucson. One more. Daniela stood with the rag in her hand and the world tilted because she was hearing Walter's voice. They didn't fire me. They made it so there was no me to fire the company. The man named Voss, the report nobody would read. The notebook in her drawer at home that she had almost left in a dumpster, that he had begged her not to take to the police. Everything the old man had told her, every word she had filed under the kindness of pretending to believe. It was true. All of it was true. She drove home through the dark with her hands shaking on the wheel, the way his had shaken on the leather cover, and she sat on the floor of the bedroom while Mateo slept, and she finally read the whole thing. Most of it she couldn't follow. Stress tables, fastener torque values, a steel grade specification with the word substituted written next to it 3 times and underlined. But some pages were in plain English, dated, addressed almost like letters to no one. SOG 2019 flagged the connector substitution in writing to GV. Told to revise my own report. Refused. OC 2019 report does not appear in the file submitted to the inspector. My name removed from the cover sheet. My access badge stops working Monday. I am not crazy. I am writing this down because they are very good at making a man look crazy. On the inside of the back cover, in pen, a single line that meant nothing to her. A string of numbers. B114. Greyhound, 24th St. The rest is there. Don't let it die with me. She did not know what B114 was. She did not yet have the courage to find out. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest in the dark and understood that she was now the only person alive who knew where a dead man had hidden the truth about why 6 people had drowned in the Salt River. She told no one. For 4 days she carried it like a stone in her gut, going to work, coming home, watching the news call it a tragic structural failure, and then a freak event. And then, as a man in a beautiful suit appeared on every channel, an unforeseeable act with no clear cause. The man was Gerald Voss, CEO of Meridian Structural, the firm that had built the crossing. He was 61, silver-haired, and he did not look like a villain. He looked tired and sincere and faintly heartbroken, and he said in a voice that cracked at exactly the right moment that his company employed 3,000 people in the state of Arizona, that they were cooperating fully, that nothing mattered more to him than the families, and that anyone suggesting Meridian had cut a corner was frankly profiting off grief. Daniela watched him say it and recognized the initials in the notebook. GV, told to revise my own report. And she understood, watching this calm, grieving man lie to a camera, exactly what Walter had meant about how good they were at making the honest man look like the crazy one. The investigator came on a Thursday. She was a federal agent from the National Transportation Safety Board, mid-40s, named Ruiz, and she came alone and in plain clothes and sat at the counter and ordered coffee before she said anything that mattered. Then she laid a photograph on the counter. Walter, years younger, in a hard hat, squinting at the sun, and said, "I'm trying to find anyone who knew this man." His name was Walter Kasiazek. He filed a safety complaint about the Salt River project 6 years ago, and then he sort of vanished out of the record. The complaint went nowhere. I think it should have gone somewhere. A trucker in our witness file said an old man matching his description used to sit in this diner every night. Booth by the window. Here was the moment Daniela had been dreading since the bridge came down. She had a brother who could not survive without her. She had $91 and an eviction date. The man on television had 3,000 employees and a lawyer for every one of them. Every careful, frightened, mathematical part of her said the same thing it had said at the dumpster. "You are nobody. Throw it away. You can't afford this. Walk back into the kitchen. I never saw him," Daniela said. Ruiz nodded slowly, like she'd expected it, and finished off into the white morning counter and walked out into the white morning light. Daniela stood there for a full minute. Then she thought about Walter's hand on the leather. She thought about the only one I trusted to carry it. She thought about a family of 3 driving home from a hospital and a spot of bridge that simply was not there. She thought, last of all and hardest, about the kind of person she would be for the rest of her life if she let a man who had been right his whole life be wrong in the record forever, because she had been too afraid. She went out the door after the agent into the parking lot and called. His middle name was Andre. Ruiz stopped walking. "He told me," Daniela said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that if anyone ever came asking, they had to know his whole name or I'd never seen him in my life." She swallowed. "Walter Andre Ksiazik. He gave me something. He said, don't take it to the police. He said, wait for someone who knew his name." The agent turned around very slowly. "Miss," she said, "what did he give you?" It went fast after that, and it went slow, the way the worst and most important things do at the same time. The leather notebook was the key, but it was not the lock. Daniela had been right to be afraid of how heavy it was, and wrong about what would happen if she lifted it. The string of numbers on the inside of the back cover, B114, Greyhound, 24th St., was a storage locker at the bus station, rented in cash, paid 2 years forward by a man who must have eaten less than the eggs Daniela bought him in order to do it. Walter had been too careful to keep everything in one place. A single notebook could be stolen, burned, dismissed as the ravings of a bitter ex-employee. So he had split it. The book she'd kept held the story. The locker held the proof. When Ruiz opened B114, she found a banker's box. The original material test reports for the connector steel, stamped and dated, showing a grade well below what the bridge's design required. The internal email chain in which Walter had flagged it in writing. The revised report submitted to the state inspector with the substandard numbers quietly corrected on paper, and Walter's name lifted off the cover, and a single approval memo authorizing the cheaper steel to maintain schedule and budget. Signed at the bottom in a hand that matched exactly the signature the whole city had watched Gerald Voss use to sign a condolence book on live television. Daniela asked Ruiz, later, the question that had been gnawing at her since the parking lot. Why her? Why would a careful man, an engineer who trusted nothing he couldn't measure, hand the most important thing he owned to a waitress he'd known 4 months instead of a lawyer, a reporter, anyone with power? And Ruiz, who had spent 20 years watching what power does to evidence, gave her the answer that made the whole thing make sense. Because he'd already tried the people with power, she said. 6 years ago. He went to the state inspector, and the inspector's office took money from Meridian. He went to a lawyer, and the lawyer wanted a retainer he didn't have. He went to a reporter once, and the reporter called Meridian for comment. And Meridian's people had him followed, and his bank flagged, and his sister called and told he was having an episode. Ruiz tapped the box. Everyone he could reach, who could help him, could also be reached by the people he was accusing. You were the only person in his life that Voss couldn't buy, couldn't scare, and couldn't find. You had no stake. That's not a weakness, Miss Reyes. To a man like him, at the end, that was the only thing on earth worth trusting. He had known. 6 years before the bridge fell, he had been told by his own engineer that it would, in writing, and he had made the engineer disappear instead of the danger. He had bet that the bridge would hold. He had bet 6 lives on a budget line, and he had been so sure he was reasonable about it that he'd kept the memo. In a deposition that Daniela was not in the room for but read about later, Voss said the thing that she would think about for years. He was not, even then, a man twirling a mustache. He was a man who genuinely believed he had been trapped. He said that going public in 2019 would have bankrupted Meridian, that 3,000 families would have lost their income, that the probability of catastrophic failure had been, by his own engineer's models, vanishingly small. He had not chosen to kill anyone, he said. He had chosen to protect 3,000 jobs against a risk he'd been told was almost nothing. He seemed to believe that the arithmetic should exonerate him. He seemed honestly bewildered that anyone could look at a man who had been trying to save thousands and call him a murderer. What he could never explain, what no spreadsheet in the world could carry for him, was the one thing Walter had understood about the job from the beginning. You sign your name, you're telling every stranger you'd put your own kid in that car. Voss had told 3,000 strangers he'd protect their paychecks. He had never once asked the 6 in the river for their permission to gamble with them. He had saved the people he could see and quietly written off the people he couldn't, and he had called that responsibility. He was charged with 6 counts of negligent homicide and a string of fraud counts under the names of the state and federal governments. Meridian Structural, the company he had buried a man's life to protect, collapsed anyway. Under the lawsuits, by the end of the following year, 3,000 people lost their jobs in the end, the exact catastrophe he had committed a crime to prevent. He had traded everything he believed in to save the company and lost the company and his freedom and the only version of himself he could stand to look at. At the sentencing, the news reported, he turned and looked for Daniela in the gallery, and when he found her, he didn't glare. He just looked at her for a moment with an exhaustion that had no bottom and said quietly, so that only the front rows heard it, "You think I'm a monster. I was only ever a man who couldn't make himself say the words, 'We were wrong.'" Daniela didn't answer him. There was nothing to say to it that the river hadn't already said. The reward was real, and the law that gave it to her was real, which surprised her more than anything. Federal statute provides for the people who hand over the evidence in fraud cases like Meridian's. The lawyers who came after Ruiz explained it to her 3 times before she let herself believe it. It was not a lottery ticket. It did not make her rich the way television makes people rich, but it was enough to make Mateo's name on a clinic schedule instead of a waiting list. It was enough for a 2-bedroom apartment with a door he could close and a small second room where he could be quiet and safe and hers. It was enough, when the rest of it had settled, to pay for a certificate program at the community college, civil engineering technology, evenings, where a 24-year-old who had built impossible towers out of anything that stacked finally got to learn the real names for the things she'd always understood by instinct. She kept her job at the diner for almost a year after, partly because she didn't quite believe the ground would stay solid, and partly for a reason she didn't explain to anyone. Walter Andre Kasiazek was buried, finally under his whole name, in a cemetery on the east side, with a marker the state paid for, because the investigation had established him as the engineer of record whose warning had been suppressed. There was no crowd. Ruiz came. Daniela came. A couple of old men who turned out to have worked the steel with him decades ago came and stood with their hands folded. When the rebuilt span of the Salt River crossing opened 2 years later, there was a small bronze plaque at the east approach, not a statue, nothing that would slow the traffic, just a plate the size of a sheet of paper that most drivers would never read. It gave his name and the dates and one line. He signed his name to the truth when it cost him everything. Danielle drove across it on the opening day, in a used car that was hers, with her brother in the passenger seat humming the tuneless private song he hummed when he was calm, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular weight of being trusted by someone who is gone, which is a thing that never fully lifts and is not supposed to. That night, on what would have been an ordinary shift if she'd still worked it, She stopped by the old diner off the interstate. The new overnight girl didn't know her. Daniela sat down at table 7, the booth by the window, and ordered a black coffee, and when it came, she didn't drink it. She set it across from her, where a man used to sit and write the truth down in a 98-cent notebook because he was afraid the world would lose it otherwise. She let it go cold. She thought about a plate of eggs that cost $2.40 and how she had never once been able to afford it and had bought it anyway, every single night, for no reason she could have defended to her landlord or her electric company or anyone doing the math on her life from the outside. She understood now, in a way she hadn't been able to at the time, that the eggs had never been about the eggs. He had been watching her for 4 months, looking for the one thing he could not buy and could not fake and could not find anywhere in a system that had failed him. A person who would do the decent thing when no one was watching, and there was nothing in it for her. He had been looking for someone he could hand the truth to and trust them not to sell it. And the only application he ever read, the only resume that ever convinced him, was a girl who lied badly about a plate of eggs. She left the cold coffee on the table and a 20 under the saucer and walked out into the warm Phoenix dark. Somewhere west of her, 2 million people were asleep in their beds, trusting that the bridges would hold, never knowing the names of the men who made sure they did, or the woman who made sure one of those names was finally written down where it belonged. Kindness doesn't need an audience. The truth doesn't need permission. And sometimes the most important thing you will ever do in your life is refuse to throw away something everyone else has decided is garbage. If this story stayed with you, there's someone near you tonight that the world has decided to stop seeing. Maybe the bravest thing you do this week is see them anyway. Tell me in the comments about a time someone small did something the powerful couldn't. I read everyone.